So let's address the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the fact that Set is not actually an Egyptian deity. Set is a Hebrew deity. In fact, Set, if you look throughout Scripture, starting in the Old Testament, going into parts of the New Testament, specifically the book of Revelation, what you see is that Set is the Hebrew God. Now, the reason why we see Set as ubiquitous is because Set has been distributed around the world through processes such as conquest, colonization, and conversion that has come along with that. When you look at the way the Abrahamic faiths have operated, as they have been dispersed or dispatched around the world, what you see is this process of Set being made prominent, Set or Seth or Shem, being made prominent through this colonization process, through this conversion process. There has been a pattern of this religious conversion throughout much of time. And what you see in more recent times, the last few hundred years, is a process whereby one arm of the Abrahamic traditions might take over through conquest, and then another arm comes through and then conquers them, and then they take over. But it's the same dynamic over and over again because no matter who is in charge, no matter who is conquering, Set is the foundation of the conquest. While Set is presented in the book of Genesis, you see Set presented over and over throughout the Old Testament, and then this grand presentation in the book of Revelation, sort of masquerading as the Messiah. However, Set is presented as the Messiah based upon the presentation of Set as Shaddai or Shaddai in the book of Genesis and throughout. You see these um, discussions about Set and these presentations of Set all throughout the Old Testament, and then again culminating in the book of Revelation with this turn in terms of personality. You have this entity understood as Jesus, understood as the Messiah. But then when John, whoever John is having this revelation in the book of Revelation, this entity known as Jesus is presented more as Set. And it's important to remember that that's not Jesus actually being presented in the book of Revelation. What you have in the book of Revelation again is John having a vision, a hallucination, a conversation with someone, but it's not an actual presentation of the entity known as Jesus. This is part of the reason why you see this personality change dynamic from the Gospels to the book of Revelation. But what's important to keep in mind here is that Set is this anti Genesis sort of deity, this anti creation deity. That's why there is so much discussion of Set or Shaddai or Shaddai engaging in revenge and retribution and destruction and chaos and war. So you see that in a number of themes in the Old Testament. And those are themes that are representative of the chaos of Set. Now, Set is presented as an Egyptian deity, a part of the Egyptian pantheon. But what we've already noted is that there is a Hebrew pantheon that is generally not discussed because the way it's presented is that these are simply different names for the same deity, but that's not actually the case. And you can even see that the deities that are named have different personalities, and so they are not the same entity, just simply going by different names. Now, back to this whole Set dynamic and Set being understood as a part of the Egyptian pantheon. The reason why this is the case is because Set is something that migrated into the Egyptian space, if that's even what you want to call the place. And so, what you have going on here through this conquest colonization process is identity appropriation and superimposition. And you've seen this all over the world when you see the Jacobites being dispersed. You see some of this identity appropriation and superimposition. When you see a number of the conquests that are moving from the east to the west, you see this constant process of identity appropriation and superimposition. What you see right now going on in the United States is a process of migration and then identity appropriation and superimposition. And when this occurs, there's chaos in terms of identity, so people don't know who they are. After a few generations, they don't even know where they came from. And so you see this process going on with Egypt with respect to the invasion of the Hyksos. And so we're going to look at that very quickly so that you can see this connection between the Hebrew and the Hyksos, and you can see how this superimposition of Set took place. Now we're going to look at this connection between the Hyksos and the Hebrews and the Egyptians so that you can start to see this relationship and how the world came under the domination of Set. And you'll start to see more clearly why Set is so ubiquitous. And here you see this depiction of the Hyksos that is coming out of Egypt. And you might want to make note of this interesting animal in the depiction. And it is similar to what's considered the Set animal. The Set animal is no specific animal that is actually known. It's some interesting hybrid of all of these different animals. And so it resembles a number of animals, but nothing that has actually been seen in nature. Another thing that you should note is that there's a crown in the depiction, and then you also have the shepherd's hook. And so there is this presentation of the Hyksos as sort of shepherd kings, as nobility, as entities that came from another space into the space, because you can see that there's a bit of distinction between what they look like and what Egyptians are presented as looking like at this time period. Now, of course, there is quite a bit of diversity in terms of phenotype with ancient Egyptian presentations, but this is consistent with some of the phenotypes that have been presented in the past. But what's important here is that crown and that shepherd's hook and this dynamic of being presented as sort of a shepherd king thing. And then, of course, you see the crown with the 3 points, and this is consistent with that letter that looks like the flaming crown, that sin letter, that shin letter. And here is yet another depiction of the Hyksos that you will come to see are essentially the Hebrews. And here is an additional depiction. Okay, so let's look at a bit of etymology information here. This is when it becomes very interesting, and this is when you start to connect the Hebrews with the Hyksos and Set. All right, now remember that Set or Seth is considered the god of not only war and chaos and all of that stuff, but also the god of the foreigners. Also, it's understood that Seth had something to do with the invasion of the Hyksos. And so he was considered a deity of the foreigners. And here you see Hyksos. This name means foreign rulers, coming out of the Egyptian into the Greek, Hyksos, shepherd kings. And you can see that again with that depiction. And so They were also understood, interestingly, as captive shepherds. And so entities that were foreign rulers, but were also captive or enslaved. And this actually coincides with a part of the narrative, of course, that's coming out of the Old Testament about how the Hebrews moved into Egypt. They were in Egypt, quite a bit of the time. But they moved into Egypt at a particular point in time, stayed there for a long period of time, really grew. Some of them, one of them in particular, rose to significant prominence in an Egyptian household as a part of the Egyptian monarchy, the Egyptian nobility, and then went on to, of course, leave and lead the Hebrews out of Egypt. And so you can see why there might not have been much surprise when Moses is given the information that he presents in the Old Testament that includes this history of Seth being the father of all humanity. And so let's move into this discussion in Britannica related to the Hyksos. Now, the Hyksos was actually an Egyptian dynasty, an entire dynasty. And what's also interesting is that it notes here that they were thought of as an influx of immigrants from Palestine into Egypt. And they brought with them, according to Britannica, all of this new technology and all of this equipment that apparently had not been present in the area that they migrated into. And they also brought with them metal weapons. This is interesting because this sort of ties into some of the dynamics that are in that interesting book of Enoch. And you also see these deities or these angelic beings in the book of Enoch being tied to a number of the things that the Hyksos brought in with them to Egypt. Now, another thing that has been noted is that these entities that came in, they not only brought in all of this technology and all of this equipment, primarily a lot of it warlike equipment, but they also brought in some of their spirituality. And we're going to look at this more closely because I want you to be able to see the spirituality that was transplanted. And so it indicates here that based upon these excavations and analyzing the findings, that you find the chief deity of the Hyksos was the Egyptian storm god and desert god Seth. Now remember, Seth is considered one of the sons of Adam and Eve. Okay. He basically replaced both Cain and Abel. It's often presented that he replaced Abel, but he replaced Cain and Abel in the narrative because he's the last son standing with respect to Noah and the ark. And so all you basically have, according to the narrative, are these descendants of Seth or Seth. Okay, so that means that everyone on the planet now is supposed to be a descendant of Seth or Set. And when you look at, again, how universal this Set or Seth concept is, you can see how this might have taken place and how colonization would make this whole dynamic spread, where you have entities who conquer indigenous people throughout the earth and then impose onto the new spaces this ancient identity with these ancient religious dynamics. And then the people in these various places take these on as if it belongs to them. And so they take on all of these names as if these are their names and this is really a part of their history and their culture. It also indicates here that this desert and storm god Seth was also identified with an another god named Hadad or Hadad. and this was a Syrian storm god. And so what you have is this situation wherein Seth is presented in many ways. You'll see Seth recapitulated based upon the name Seth. And so you see all of these transliterations of Seth or Set. But then you also see these dynamics wherein there are other names that are not necessarily close to Set or Seth, but they mean the same thing. You see all of these words, and there are so many that, in terms of etymology, are coming from this construct of Set or Seth. We're going to look at some of those so that you can get a better idea. But there are some words like the word state, for instance, that comes out of the construct of Set or Seth. Words that end in stan, STAN, those countries, those geopolitical spaces, that's also a manifestation of Set or Seth. Again, this Set or Seth is ubiquitous, and you will find Set or Seth in many places that you might not have anticipated. And then those who are considered the descendants of Seth or Set, you will find them in many places. For instance, you find in India this manifestation of Abram or Abram, and also Sarah in terms of deities. And so this push to spread Set or Seth or Shem, all of this, you will see the manifestations all over the world. And you'll see it even in cultures that you might not expect to see it in. And here we have this other very odd dynamic. The Hyksos apparently had a pharaoh, and the pharaoh, the name of the pharaoh, is essentially synonymous with this entity that was supposedly conquered by Seth or Set. And you see this Hyksos pharaoh, Apophis or Apophis, or also Apep or Pepi. So you see this in the Egyptian histories, but this name is tied to the Hyksos pharaoh. It's tied to the Hyksos. It's tied to the Hebrew. And this entity is a serpent entity. And so again, you see this worshiping of this serpent deity. This was common in terms of Hebrew history. You see it repeated over and over and over again. And so, and these chimeric entities. And so you see it again here where this Pharaoh has this name, but there's also a dynamic of this deification of a number of entities that appear to be regular entities that are then raised to deity status. And so here we see this manifestation of this Apophis or Apepi. And so here you see Seth or Set, again, the hidden deity, inside of the Hyksos. You see this Set or Seth inside of this Hyksos pharaoh, and you see this Seth or Set inside of the entity that Set or Seth purportedly conquered. And so you see there's really a merging of these identities here. And what's also noteworthy is that this Set or Seth deity is also presented as the dragon. And so this is important to keep in mind when you are looking at not only the Old Testament, but in the book of Revelation. And so when you look at the book of Revelation, what you see is this dragonish sort of entity uh, that appears to be in conflict with that which is good. But what you also see is there is a merging of these entities. You also see that this is a part of that dynamic wherein the personality that is presented in the Gospels of Jesus is a totally different personality than the one that is presented in the book of Revelation. The one that is presented in the book of Revelation is completely consistent with Set or Seth and completely inconsistent with the entity that is in those Gospels, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so it's very interesting to note how the New Testament is wrapped up with this Set or Seth deity. When, if you leave out the book of Revelation, you don't have the Set or Seth entity as blatant in your face. But that's what is being presented in the book of Revelation. It's unclear why that has not been addressed, but in terms of personality, those are totally different personalities. And that entity in the book of Revelation is a destroyer entity, a complete destroyer entity, a chaotic entity. This entity is one that talks about world domination, world rule. And those who are on the side of this entity in the book of Revelation will be given that power as proxy to rule the world. And so, therefore, you see a number of individuals who buy into this and want to tie themselves into it by identifying with the entities that are in the Old Testament. So then it brings them into relationship with this Seth or Set entity in the book of Revelation, wherein they are going to be given that hook, that rod of iron that will be used as a destroying tool. Now, as you look more into this dynamic of Set or Seth, what you will see with respect to this anti Genesis dynamic is that these various narratives in Scripture involve the usurpation of the firstborn, the Genesis, the beginning, that first one. And then what you also see is this pattern of these entities spreading across the world and supplanting or usurping all of the indigenous people around the world. You see this over and over. And then you see this process of bringing other people all around the world to take on the identities and the land and the possessions of the indigenous people. So there is this constant process of supplanting and identity theft and superimposition of these uh, religious, spiritual dynamics. And you see it over and over and over again. And that's really a part, the major part of the colonization dynamic. It's very difficult to get a handle on all of it because we've been presented a way of looking at the world that is a phenotype based way of looking at the world. But what's going on in terms of the world is that there is a connection between people who want to rule the world, these megalomaniac personalities that want to rule other people, that want to control other people, that have these narcissistic fantasies about their positions in the world. And so they want to be seen as extremely special. And the relationship between them and this Set or Seth is what gives them this special feeling. It's not about anything that they have actually accomplished, it's simply about their identity and identifying with this entity, understanding this entity as sort of a parental figure, understanding this Set entity as an overpowering deity in terms of the world. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon. Hopefully, if you have some more insight on this whole Hyksos thing, this Set or Seth migration throughout the world, please share that with us so that we all get a better understanding along the way. Thank you.